Charles Chen, President Shapiro, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The 6 months since I received the 2018 Yidan Prize in Education Research has been a pretty exciting time for me, as you can probably guess. But I'd like to begin by thanking Charles Chen for envisioning education as a vehicle for creating a more just and prosperous world, and for creating this prize that aligns with his vision. As Morty alluded, I think I was particularly happy to receive this award because I think I'm a living example of the power of education to change lives. As he mentioned, I grew up near a small city in one of the poorest parts of California, was then, still is. Both of my parents worked in unskilled jobs. My father actually earned the minimum legal wage until his retirement. And although I grew up close to a college, when I was a child, my family didn't even know anybody who went to college. It wasn't just that they didn't go to college, they didn't know anybody who went to college. The appellation college kids was applied to what seemed to be an alien species that inhabited a world that was remote from our own personal experience. Yet, because of the opportunity education afforded, I was able to get a Regents Scholarship to go to the University of California, to eventually get a PhD, and ultimately become a distinguished researcher in one of the greatest universities in the world. And that could not have happened without the education opportunities that I had. This award, the Yidan Prize, honors education's role in civilization. And it compels us to think deeply about education, about how it works, and how it can be made more effective to advance the goals of society. To me personally, what's priceless about this is that the Yidan Prize shines a bright light on the work that I've devoted much of my life to, and that is improving education research so that it can provide answers that we so desperately need to improve education in the 21st century, to make it achieve the goals we all hope that it can. I believe that we are, I'm going to see if I can make that work. Yeah, I believe that we're in the beginning of an era that's going to vastly transform education worldwide. We know that it's possible for almost any student to learn almost anything that the best students can, but we don't know how to make that possible for all students today, and I'm going to return to that theme. The problem with education isn't that educators aren't dedicated enough or that they care too little about their students or that they aren't keen observers. The problem is that too much of what we know about education depends on our own personal experience and unstructured observation. No one of us experiences any more than a tiny bit of the education world in our country. But as people do, we make sense of the experience we have and draw understandings from it. Understandings that we believe apply to the rest of the world of education that we know very little about, have no direct experience with. Now, this is unavoidable. This is what human beings do. It's adaptive in most of the parts of our life. The problem is that it's often quite misleading. I think one of the old saws from social science is that the function of social science is to help people understand which things they know are actually true. And since education is a social science, I think the application there is that people know a lot about education, and a lot of what they know isn't true, or it's at least far more complex than they understand. So education science has the function of helping us sort out the facts from the beliefs. The fact that much of what people know about education is derived from casual experience makes education susceptible to magic bullet thinking, belief in panaceas. We can lurch from one fad to another and return often with renewed enthusiasm to a panacea that was discarded years ago, at least if it was long enough ago that people have forgotten that they tried it once. And what's really sad about this is that we never know if any of the things that were tried actually worked. There are many education products, interventions, and practices. Some are undoubtedly useful, but there's too little good research to tell us whether they work, and if so, when and how they work. There's far too much belief in miracles, which is sometimes, to illustrate what I mean by miracles, it's sometimes expressed in deep commitments to particular single strategies, exemplified by statements like, the way to fix education is, and then that's followed by something like choice, or charter schools, or better leadership, or lesson study, or technology, or project-based learning, or authentic practices. Take your pick. Those ideas are all being advocated by various people. Which of them work? Well, possibly all and maybe none. And the particular circumstances may affect whether any of them work. But none of them alone provides a coherent framework for understanding teaching and learning and the development of competence in society. I like to describe human endeavors as falling into one of two categories. This is something of an ideal type, so bear in mind that it's not an exact description of the work world. But there are craft endeavors like sculpture and carpentry, where the knowledge is largely the result of experience, and practitioners improve as they actually carry out their individual practice. And then there are scientifically driven endeavors like engineering and, at least as of the 20th century, medicine, where knowledge is created at least partly by investigators who are often not practitioners. Now, these two types, of course, overlap. There's science in being an artist in the form of technique and systematic knowledge, and there's artistry in the form of intuition and practical skills in being a scientist. But this distinction is useful because when we look at how education has traditionally been experienced in America and in most other countries, it's been shaped largely as a craft endeavor, fundamentally guided by personal experience and apprenticeship. All too often, decisions for the future were generated by tradition or politics or individual experience or sometimes prejudice. There's nothing wrong with craft systems. They've served society well for centuries, but in the face of a time when there are demands for rapid change, craft systems adapt too slowly to be useful. And I argue that substantial improvements in education are the kind we need today are only going to arrive after our education systems begin to pay more attention to scientific evidence. The challenge of education in the 21st century is similar to the challenge to improve medicine and public health in the 20th. In 1890, we knew that people could live healthy and productive lives into their 70s because there were examples. But most people didn't, and we didn't know how to ensure that most people would. By 1990, and I should mention that in 1890, the average life expectancy for a white man in the U.S. was about 38 years. 100 years later, by 1990, life expectancy had doubled, and people routinely lived productive and healthy lives into their 70s. Why did that happen? Well, it wasn't because doctors became smarter. It wasn't because we developed, it wasn't because they became keener observers or better apprentices or cared more about their patients. It was because we developed the scientific basis that is used throughout the world for medical care today and for public health today. Today we know that almost any student can learn almost anything that the best ones can, but we don't know how to make it happen routinely. There's no shortage of ideas, and whether such ideas thrive on anecdote or on scientific investigation is really the key question. Just like a patient gets better for reasons unrelated to treatment, sometimes students learn things for reasons unrelated to education interventions. It's true. Medical science has discovered that if you want to understand what works, it's imperative to study many patients and many doctors in order to get the data that's going to definitively help you identify that. Similarly, we've learned in education science that we have to analyze data on many students in dozens of schools in order to conclude which interventions work. Now, education is a complex enterprise with many facets, and I believe that the future is going to be enhanced if we rely on rigorous evidence for answers about what to do. To understand education, we have to study all its interlocking features and apply the best scientific methods available. Teaching and learning, curriculum and instruction are vital to examine, but so is the organization of schools, and so is the organization of other places where learning takes place. We have to close the chasm between investigators and practitioners. That we have to make sure that evidence is accessible and accessed by those who can best use it, teachers and administrators, policymakers, and parents. But just compiling knowledge stops short. The next step is to make sure that these discoveries get converted into things that make a difference in the classroom and in policy practice. You know, if you imagine an education system that seamlessly integrates fresh knowledge with direct channels to disseminate that knowledge and systematically use it in classrooms and schools, you know, that sounds like a kind of nirvana. And this ideal, which is innovation fueled by research that's promptly put into practice, would be an effective countermeasure to the potent backward pull of tradition, politics, personal experience, and prejudices. The issue is, how can we persuade people that this culture of evidence is something they need to embrace? And I know it's not going to be easy. I'm not naive enough to think that there won't be resistance. There's always a natural inertia of people and institutions. Entrenched interests will be against it. The publishing, testing, and educational technology business is making a lot of money from the system the way it works right now. A focus on evidence would impose new requirements on products. You know, things that don't work might be at a disadvantage in the marketplace, for example. And we'll have to change how we train future teachers and administrators, and the institutions responsible for that training may not want to change, or at least not all of them may want to change. At Northwestern, I think that will be different. Such a change, the kind of change that I'm advocating, might sound impossible, but it's really not unprecedented. In the 20th century, medical practitioners moved from reliance on what was learned from their own observations and testing things on their own patients, their own particular patients, to greater reliance on organized research in human biology and large-scale clinical research. There was resistance in the medical community to the emergence of more scientifically based medicine, but it was overcome. And I think despite predictable resistance, we can bring the same kind of transformation to education. Now, in medicine, that transformation occurred gradually over about a century. And I've seen no evidence that it was planned in any detail and orchestrated by any particular group. I believe that a transformation of this kind can occur more quickly in education if it's purposefully directed and we sort of take control of our own evolution. And I'm certain there are many in education who'd like to move in a more scientific direction. The education reform efforts in the U.S. since the year 2000 are examples of a systematic attempt to make education research more scientific. This began, I think, with the Education Science Reform Act that created the U.S. Institute of Education Sciences. We all know it fondly by its acronym, IES. And it was helped along by some provisions of the No Child Left Behind Act that emphasized scientific evidence. And I think it's pretty clear to all of us that the work of IES since the time of its creation has influenced other agencies and other institutions that are involved with education, and it's really made a huge change in the field of education research. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm not pleading for scientific approaches to education because I happen to have a quaint affection for science as a field. I'm doing it because science is the most important tool yet developed to understand the world and to improve human welfare. Education is just too important to society for its practices not to be based on the best available scientific evidence. As we move to use more scientific evidence in education, there are things we can learn from the path that medicine has followed. I'm particularly interested in and want to emphasize the recent progress that's been made in what's called evidence-based medicine. Now, if you're not steeped in modern medical education, you might be asking, what is evidence-based medicine? And if you ever go to the doctor, you might be asking, well, wasn't it always evidence-based? But let me give you one explanation of what evidence-based medicine is all about. Evidence-based medicine advocates that to the greatest extent possible, decisions and policy should be based on evidence, not just beliefs of practitioners, experts, or administrators. It tries to assure that a clinician's opinion, which may be limited by knowledge gaps or biases, is supplemented with all available evidence from scientific literature so that the best practice can be determined and applied. It promotes the use of formal, explicit methods to analyze evidence and make it accessible to policymakers and decision makers. Here they actually think of physicians as making decisions about practice policy. And it promotes programs to teach these methods to students, practitioners, and policymakers. I didn't write that, but there's little or nothing in it that couldn't be applied directly to education with hardly a word changed. And I believe that's the kind of evidence-based education practice we need to move to. Now, the transformation of education into a field that is evidence-based is going to require time and serious effort on many people's parts, but it is instructive to look at the history of evidence-based medicine. Now, some of the ideas underlying evidence-based medicine have their origins in antiquity, and medical research as an enterprise was certainly a going thing throughout much of the 20th century. But evidence-based medicine, as we know it today, as I just described it, really has its roots only in the 1960s, because during the 1960s and continuing into the 1980s, there was a growing awareness that physician decision-making was often afflicted by errors in reasoning and gaps in evidence. In the 1970s and 1980s, there began to be quite good research that documented the fact that there was wide variation in how physicians practiced medicine, and that their practices were often inconsistent with what was believed at the time to be best practice. Evidence-based medicine really became prominent only in the 1980s, and I believe that my friend David Eddy was the first to use the term evidence-based in 1987 workshops that he began doing to teach formal methods for designing practice guidelines. In 1989, the first textbook that based its recommendations for practice entirely on research was published. It was called Effective Care in Pregnancy and Childbirth. Two of its authors are really remarkable men. They wrote this book based on 10 years of effort trying to compile evidence about their field, and they have had a tremendous impact on evidence-based medicine since that time. Particularly Ian, who's now Sir Ian Chalmers, before his work in evidence-based medicine. But I want to remind you, just for some history here, that if 1987 is the coining of the term evidence-based medicine, that means evidence-based medicine is only about 30 years old. The first textbook in evidence-based medicine is certainly only 30 years old. You might also remember, as a historical point, that the first modern randomized trial in medicine, the streptomycin trial, just happened in 1948. So the era of sound causal evidence in medical research is only about 70 years old, and evidence-based medicine is 30 years old. So it's of interest that rigorous causal research in medicine is younger than some of the folks in this room. Now, what does this tell us about the application of scientific research to improve education? To begin with, it's important to recognize that the goal shouldn't be to replace all professional judgment about policies or practice with research results, but to supplement what we know, our own professional judgment, with the best available scientific evidence, and there will be more or less available depending on the particular question and situation. So how did they accomplish this transformation in medicine? Well, there was a strong research infrastructure and strong advocates for evidence in medicine. We certainly have that in education today. The U.S. Institute of Education Sciences and, to some extent, the National Science Foundation and many private foundations, some of which have representatives in this room today, certainly are strong advocates for creation and use of evidence in education. We need to understand what made evidence-based medicine possible is not one thing, but an entire ecosystem of the creation, synthesis, and dissemination of evidence to practitioners and policymakers. And I use the word ecosystem advisedly. I use it to imply that this isn't a unidirectional flow of information from research creators to research users, but a joint enterprise in which practitioners and policymakers are deeply involved in both the creating of information and the consuming of it. Let's see. Okay. It's not enough to provide evidence that pleases researchers, and that's what most researchers are in the business of doing. Sadly, we have to produce evidence that is relevant for practice, and we have to communicate it in a way that makes policymakers and practitioners able to understand it and see its relevance to what they're doing. This is impossible if researchers work in a vacuum that excludes the ultimate audience of their work. Clinical research in medicine is deeply intertwined with patient care and powerfully shaped by the clinicians doing that care. Education research needs to be better informed by practitioners. To be relevant, it has to respond to the needs of practice, but without losing the rigor that makes it worth doing in the first place. Producing evidence is only part of the ecosystem, and for reasons I just pointed out, it can't happen properly without its organic integration to the rest of the system. The scientific research literature is large and diverse, and it's often difficult to find relevant evidence. And just as important, when you find it, it's often difficult, even for specialists, to know whether the evidence you found is good or bad. One of the most important insights that has come from about 40 years of work in meta-analysis and systematic research reviewing is that while every scientist is absolutely sure they can tell good studies from bad, the overwhelming empirical evidence is they can't make those distinctions reliably, on a global basis. This may sound like academic nitpicking, but bear in mind that as far as education is concerned, we're in the patent medicine era. People can peddle whatever they want on the internet. No doubt many of the peddlers are sincere believers in what they advocate, but believing doesn't make it so. There's plenty of, in addition, there's plenty of advocacy out there, and it's often masquerading as research. And there's plenty of downright advertisement masquerading as research. Advertisement that's primarily compelled by financial motives. If this doesn't resonate with your experience, just think about the level of misinformation that's rampant in other areas of American life. In an era of alternative facts, identifying reliable evidence is important, but not always easy. The role of the expert reviewer and evaluator in research has emerged as an essential component of evidence-based medicine as well as evidence-based education. So this is a new role that's kind of emerged with the emergence of evidence-based policy and practice. It's a role that actually requires considerable amount of professional competence, and it also involves specialized training and specialized methods. I can say this because I've been involved in doing some of that training of specialists, and it's non-trivial stuff. You might be interested to know that that role exists in other areas other than medicine and education. In certain of the physical sciences, there is a key role for people who review research and try to figure out, which studies are reliable and which estimates of various things are reliable and which aren't, and how to integrate them. But just being able to find relevant studies and even being able to evaluate them isn't enough. Most important issues of scientific theory or policy or practice have been addressed in more than one study. And that raises the question of how do we interpret multiple sources of evidence on the same topic. Now, I think here, conventions of scientific discourse like statistical significance testing actually have gotten in our way because they make things sound more definitive than they actually are. We say things like the treatment effect is statistically significant, and that sounds as if it settles the issue. But the very reason we use statistics in the first place is because research results are uncertain. They're subject to chance variation. And the interpretation of multiple uncertain quantities is fraught with inference traps. And by inference traps, what I mean is a plausible sounding logic that can lead you to incorrect conclusions. And some of the standards of scientific discourse lead us directly into inference traps when we're trying to understand and interpret multiple studies. The field of statistics called meta-analysis emerged precisely to provide systematic and valid ways to address inference from multiple studies on the same or related questions. And as a historical note, meta-analysis actually grew out of the needs of education in the early 1980s, but it emerged coincidentally, just at the right time to support the emergence of evidence-based medicine. So one of the reasons I know a lot of the characters who were around at the beginnings of evidence-based medicine was because, they were talking to people like me to learn about the meta-analytics theory that we had developed in education so they could apply it in medicine. And that includes, for example, Syrian. I think it's a fair statement that evidence-based medicine would be impossible without meta-analysis. And I think it's interesting that now the methods of meta-analysis can play an important role in supporting the development of evidence-based education research, fulfill the promise that they couldn't earlier in the era. In the ecosystem of education research and development, the functions of identifying relevant evidence and synthesizing it have a crucial role. Journals that are devoted to reviews of research, a couple of examples are the Review of Educational Research and Psychological Bulletin. Journals of that sort, and there are journals of that sort in almost every field of science, typically have a very prominent role and a very large scholarly impact. But a new kind of entity has emerged that has the same role of identifying, evaluating, and synthesizing and communicating research, and that's the role of research clearinghouses. Clearinghouses bring consistent practices and procedures to the science of evaluating and synthesizing research. And although you may not be aware of it, there are now some 30 entities that identify themselves as research clearinghouses. These range from big ones like the What Works Clearinghouse in Education and Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, which has a slightly broader portfolio, and to some smaller clearinghouses and more specialized clearinghouses. And by the way, we have representatives, I think, of both the What Works Clearinghouse and Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development here in the audience today. So, there are also other organizations that don't label themselves as clearinghouses, but they perform much the same function. These include international professional organizations like the Cochrane Collaboration and the Campbell Collaboration. The Cochrane Collaboration in medicine, actually, Syrian Chalmers got the Cochrane Collaboration started, and he had a big role in helping the Campbell Collaboration get started in the social sciences. And these organizations support production and dissemination of research syntheses and systematic reviews that meet very high standards, and they fill an important role in communicating between researchers and the rest of the world. But clearinghouses have another function beyond evaluating and synthesizing research. They make their syntheses generally available to anyone through publicly accessible websites. And this function is really crucially important because much of scientific research today is sequestered behind paywalls that for-profit journal publishers erect in order to sell their products. Those of us who are lucky enough to be in major research universities like this one have access to that world behind the paywall through our research libraries. But most people, most teachers, most education administrators don't have access to that world of evidence. In fact, even our own alumni don't have access to it. I once suggested that we provide our alumni with access to the library's electronic journals as a continuing benefit of a Northwestern education. And when I suggested that, I was told in no uncertain terms that would be ruinously expensive for the university, and the idea was a complete non-starter. But it illustrates the point. Making easily interpretable syntheses of research available to anybody really democratizes the access to information. And I think we need to recognize that the knowledge created by the education research enterprise and other research enterprises that society supports should be available to everyone and not just the favored few. Now, I've worked a lot of my career on methods for conducting meta-analyses and research syntheses that were generally going to be used by other researchers. Because research clearinghouses are places that are dedicated to making research generally available. They have a special responsibility to make their evidence syntheses understandable to mere mortals, the rest of the world beyond just the elite researchers. And this is a role in which I think clearinghouses are frankly struggling. Translating research evidence into something generally understandable is in its infancy. how best to convey to non-researchers ideas like magnitude of treatment impacts, the uncertainty of those impacts, their heterogeneity or their context dependence. Those are all open questions. There's a major research agenda to be tackled here, and it needs to be tackled with the best available scientific methods, and it's going to require people from several different disciplines to attack this seriously. And I do believe it's extremely important. Just on that point, I want to comment that I've been in more than one meeting of researchers where some perfectly reasonable person, even a director of IES, for example, would say something like, well, we're here today because we have to figure out how to represent such and such a concept so that practitioners can understand it. Now, I think that's a stunningly arrogant and naive thing to say. For a set of researchers to believe that they can figure out how to communicate complex ideas to practitioners without any practitioners even being in the room. When people say that, I usually say something like, wait a minute, the people in this room are all statisticians. We're probably the least capable people to try to solve that problem. You know, we got to get some people in here that we're trying to communicate to. If we want to learn to communicate complicated, difficult concepts, we need to find out how the audience interprets them, our intended audience interprets them. We need to find out, how they can engage their help in helping us, create representations that are better, that are more interpretable. We need to find out precisely what the audience cares about. And if they don't care about knowing what we're trying to communicate, then we need to, and we think some of those things are important, we need to develop ways of giving the audience some intuition about why they ought to care about those things. The work of creating a translation science like this, I think, is inherently multidisciplinary. It's going to involve the methods of cognitive science, so obviously cognitive scientists need to be involved. It's going to necessarily involve statisticians and substantive researchers, as well as policymakers and practitioners. None of these groups can do it alone. Developing a translation science is a complicated undertaking, but it's essential if we're going to secure the benefits of evidence-based education in policy and practice. Now, I've described this ecosystem of education, research, and development, and I talked about how it needs to be highly bidirectional in flows of information between researchers, synthesizers, and practitioners. And I may have made it sound as if it already existed or it was vibrant and healthy, but that's unfortunately not the case. Parts of it need really serious attention. I mentioned the science of translation of research results, and I think it's probably the area that needs the most urgent attention and the most immediate attention. But an equally important problem is that the translation of practitioner needs into researcher problems, researchable problems, is also a vital need. It's how we secure the bidirectional flows of information from the people who are out in the trenches and those of us trying to help them by doing relevant research. But an equally important problem but I think in addition to that problem, that's an important problem, but in addition to that, there are other problems that need to be solved in other areas of this research and development ecosystem. There are problems that need to be solved in the area of research design and in research synthesis as well. Now, I have been in the room several times, been fortunate to be in the room several times when Charles Chen has called us to action to improve education. And I'd like to conclude my remarks by saying we are moving to action here at Northwestern. With some of the support provided by the Yidan Prize for Education Research, we're launching a new research center here within the Institute for Policy Research. It's devoted to evidence-based policy and practice, and it's going to be called it is called the Center for Statistics in Evidence-Based Policy and Practice, the STEPP Center. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Beth Tipton, who's the co-director of the center, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about the center and the partnerships and projects that we've already begun as we move to action. Beth?
I'm excited to announce the creation of our new center, which Larry just told you the name of, the Center for Statistics on Statistics for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice, which we're calling the STEPP Center. The home will be in the Institute for Policy Research, and it will be co-directed by Larry and I with affiliates both within Northwestern and beyond. Why do we need a center? You may notice that there are already a lot of centers and organizations focused on evidence-based policy in health, medicine, social welfare, and education. What is it that we can bring to the table here? The answer is methods. As statisticians deeply entrenched in the education and social science research communities, we've seen firsthand how the development of new methods radically changes the questions researchers ask, the answers they provide, and the problems they open up for discussion. Take meta-analysis as an example. When Larry began the development of meta-analysis, he didn't divine it out of thin air. He listened to the mounting questions and problems researchers in the social sciences were asking as they dealt with an increasing volume of research. By starting from first principles, Larry and a community of statisticians developed methods for measuring effects that were comparable across studies, methods for aggregating findings, methods for exploring variation, and so on. These methods have provided scientists with the tools for systematically and cumulatively building knowledge and are the backbone of the research clearinghouses Larry just mentioned. Our vision for the center is to take this way of thinking, to institutionalize it, and expand the community of statisticians, methodologists, and researchers in the world of evidence-based policy and practice. The work of the STEPP Center will focus on 3 areas. First, the development of methods for generating evidence. These methods focus on the design and analysis of individual studies, whether we're talking about psychology laboratory studies or large-scale field experiments in schools. Recent innovations here have included designs to improve the precision of estimates, designs and analyses focused on improving the ability to generalize findings from these studies. Second, the development of methods for synthesizing evidence. Meta-analysis is clearly the backbone here. But meta-analysis itself is a very broad field and topic. We know a lot about methods that are appropriate for large, highly heterogeneous syntheses found in the social sciences. These studies typically have over 100 studies in them. But smaller meta-analyses are becoming increasingly common, both in the clearinghouse context that Larry spoke of earlier, and in the world of replication studies. Third, there is the translation of evidence. How do we best convey results from single studies and syntheses to policymakers, practitioners, parents, the media? You will note that the screen is blank in the space allocated here for existing methods. The STEPP Center is aiming to change this. Over the past half-century, methods for generating and synthesizing evidence have coalesced into a science. We now have research designs, statistical models, estimators, measures of uncertainty, and studies of the robustness of these methods, entire fields devoted to these areas. We need a similar science of translation. Why do I say science? Remember, science is about systems, processes, the building of cumulative knowledge through experimentation and observation. As statisticians, this is what we live for. How will STEPP Center approach this? We've spent the last several months focused on how this center will work. What will our approach be, and how will it differ from other ways of tackling these translational challenges? One approach, which Larry has alluded to, would be to start with what we already know, how to generate and synthesize knowledge, and to turn to the same researchers to think about how to translate knowledge. That would be very comfortable for us. Those are our friends. We are not the only people thinking about this. Recent convenings of education researchers have had themes like knowledge to action, the evidence behind evidence use, lost in translation, relevance and rigor, making it matter, and improving the practice and usefulness of research. The world is hungry for this. And yet, time and time again, we have found ourselves in rooms full of statisticians, methodologists, and researchers making fundamental decisions about the appropriate way to translate evidence without a single practitioner in the room or a single research study to inform these deliberations. Our approach is different. We want to begin with translation. How practitioners think and what they need from us as a community should have downstream implications for how we synthesize and generalize evidence, or generate evidence. In statistical terms, the practitioners and policymakers should be driving the parameters that we later figure out how to estimate. We in the education sciences don't know much about the best ways to communicate magnitude, uncertainty, heterogeneity, and context. The metrics we use and the tools we provide assume that practitioners think the way that we do. But what if the message received isn't what we intended? There are larger questions, too, about the structures and processes and systems, the science of the translation process. As a community, we know surprisingly little about evidence use broadly. Our goal is to change this. The only way we can improve translation is to create opportunities for conversation. Our plan is to create research salons on translation topics, bringing together practitioners, policymakers, researchers, methodologists, and statisticians. These salons will be topic-focused, and we hope will generate research projects, studies, experiments that provide insight into the development of best practices. This is not purely aspirational. We are already in the process of planning one such meeting focused on the translation of knowledge from clearinghouses. We are partnering with the Gates Foundation to bring together representatives from clearinghouses worldwide, as well as school principals, teacher educators, and superintendents for a meeting this summer. For researchers in clearinghouses, we hope the STEPP Center will provide up-to-date best practices, tutorials, online tools, and training opportunities. We want our website to be the place people turn to for state-of-the-art in methodology, communicated in ways that are digestible to people other than statisticians. We are excited to have you here today and hope you enjoy the next two panels, which we have developed with the STEPP Center in mind. We welcome any suggestions, including individuals and organizations that we might want to partner with or involved, both within Northwestern and beyond. Please feel free to nominate yourself. And check out our website, stepp.center. Thank you.